Our next speaker is Steve McCarthy. Now, a funny thing about Steve, there's a lot of things funny about Steve. He's a funny man. The thing about Steve is someone once told my wife and I that we should meet him, and it was a few years ago. And we didn't. It didn't for whatever reason. We meet him this January in Denver, of all places. And we went, wait, you're the person that so-and-so told me about. And then he starts coming to One Church, and it was a very serendipitous thing. But now that I've walked down memory lane, Steve is a former area director for Young Life. If you're not familiar with Young Life is a nonprofit, and they're dedicated to sharing the gospel with unchurched adolescents. Steve loves being creative, storytelling, and seeing people reach to their full potential. He's currently a filmmaker and designer, and he resides in Mesa. Would you give a warm welcome to Steve McCarthy?
So a few years ago, I was standing on the stage of a Young Life camp in Southern California. I just finished a week of speaking to middle school students. So there's a couple hundred middle school students. They're trudging, like actually mobbing out of the room. And one of the veteran Young Life staff people comes up to me and he says, hey, listen, you were amazing. It was so good. Hey, just one piece of feedback. I didn't feel like we really got to know you. And my heart sank, not because I can't take criticism, but because I agreed with him. I knew that they hadn't really gotten to know me. See, in Young Life, there is a ton of storytelling that happens. We tell stories about Jesus. We would tell stories about our personal lives. And for adolescents, hearing stories of love, of those first crushes, those are always so popular. And I didn't have any of those stories. Well, I did have one of those stories, but it wasn't the kind of thing that I would tell at a Young Life camp. When I was 14 years old, I walked into a bowling alley with some friends, and I heard a laugh from a few lanes over, and I turned and I looked, and there was another boy about my age, and I was totally just taken by him. And I loved his smile and his laugh. And I went home that night, and I was so confused. See, I grew up in a fundamentalist church. We didn't talk about homosexuality. I didn't know what that was. And so I was confused. I was like, what is going on? What am I experiencing right now? And it was in high school that I began to learn. In high school, I started being exposed to broader Christian thought and ideas. And this confusion that I had about my sexuality became a panic as I wondered, oh gosh, what does this mean? Can I change this? What do I do with this? Did I do something wrong? And that panic gave way to fear and terror. I remember the very first word that I ever associated with gay people was monsters. I remember sitting in church and hearing preachers talk about this. I remember after 9/11 happened during my senior year, hearing people on TV saying that the LGBT community had caused 9/11 to happen because America was starting to accept them. And all of that drove home one message to me, and the message was this: hide. Do not let anybody know. Never talk about this, because you are not safe here. It was also during high school when I first had the thought that maybe I should take my own life. And that was a thought that stuck with me for a long time. It was this constant voice in the back of my head that no one would accept you if they really knew who you were. No one would love you if they really knew who you were. And maybe you're better off dead. It was also in high school that I got involved with Young Life. And Young Life for me was an escape from all of these emotions that I was going through. Young Life was a place where I could go and have fun and make friends. And it was also a place where I made meaningful connections with other adults. And so after I graduated from high school, I decided to become a Young Life leader. And I absolutely loved it. I was really good at it. I met so many amazing people through that organization. And so I was kind of living this paradox in that on the outside, my life looked great. I had a ton of friends. We were constantly going on trips together, all that sort of thing. But it was in like the quiet moments after I would get home, sitting in my room, that voice would come back, say no one would love you if they really knew who you were. And the thing about keeping this kind of secret in is eventually it just blows up inside of you. And I reached a point when I was 20 years old where I was like, I can't do this anymore. I remember sitting down with my best friend Jeff on the top landing of our apartment and trying to figure out how to say the words, what words I should say, and finally telling him, convinced that I was putting this friendship in jeopardy, convinced that my Christian friend could reject me in that moment. And he didn't. He sat there and he cried with me. He said that I love you. And a year after that, 2 years after that, I was the best man in his wedding. He's still my best friend today. And so I had these initial moments of Jeff and several other friends who were accepting me and saying, hey, we love you. My parents loved me through that process. And then after that initial coming out of telling maybe a dozen people, I was like, all right, time to button this thing down. Don't tell anybody else. And I figured I would trade any sort of love life that I might have in the future. I'll trade that for ministry. And so I just dove headfirst into ministry. I was working constantly, planning Bible studies, speaking, all sorts of things. And then several years into that, one of the students that I was really close with committed suicide. And it was an event that totally rocked my world. It messed me up so bad. I was angry at God. I was angry at the world as a whole. And for the very first time in my life, I decided to take a hard look at this theology that I'd been handed on all sorts of things. And eventually started to think about, have I been right about sexuality, about what the Bible says? And so I started digging into it. I discovered that the verses I'd been given on it were not nearly as clear as I'd initially been told. But more so than that, it was looking at the fruit in my own life. Young Life, one of the core verses that they talk about is John 10:10, where Jesus says, I have come that you might have life and life to the full. Another way to say that is, I've come that you might have life, an abundant life. And so I had to ask, was I experiencing an abundant life? Were my friends who were also gay and trying to stick around with Christianity, were they experiencing an abundant life? Because everywhere I looked, I saw bad fruit. Doing ministry taught me that you can't separate theology from people. You can't just take these ideas without considering how do they affect the flesh and blood human that we're talking about. And so slowly, and these are all the things that are rattling around my head, when one day I get a text, and it's from a friend of mine, and he says, hey, can I come over? I need to talk to you. And instinctively I knew he's going to come out to me. I had about 5 minutes. What am I going to tell him? Is there any part of me left that believes that this might be wrong? And I realized then that I couldn't ask anyone else to go through what I had been through. I couldn't ask anyone else to suffer the way that I felt like I had been suffering. I couldn't put anyone else on a path that might lead to their death. So he came over, told me that he was bi, said, I love you and I'm proud of you, and that was it. And so for me, at that point, I was still super scared about leaving Young Life, about leaving this job that I had loved, about what the implications might be for my community, for the rest of my friendships who still didn't know that I was gay. But as the years went on, not too many years, year and a half went on, many years, I started having panic attacks, which was new for me and super scary. I continued to just live in fear of what would happen if people found out. And I realized the writing was on the wall, that I couldn't keep living this way. It wasn't sustainable at all. And so, once again, as a 30-something adult, began the coming out process again. And so, began telling other people. And once again, all those same old fears came up when you're sitting across from somebody at a bar or a coffee shop, and you're like, man, I just really wish they would provide a good transition point right now. Like, could someone just be like, so, dudes? Like, that would be great. But it never happened. And so we just start talking, and I'd sort of be like awkwardly like, by the way. And again, what I've learned is that people will really surprise you. There were people I was convinced would probably be nice, but also would probably think I was going to hell. And some of those people have been some of my closest friends throughout this process. Yeah. And that was, I didn't realize what I was missing because I was so focused on what I could lose. I was so concerned about, oh my gosh, I'm going to lose my job and my friends. And I was wrapped up in this fear of what would happen that I never stopped to consider what I might gain in that process. And what I gained in that was friends who told me that they love me more now because they know me more better. What I gained in that is new community, new connections. What I gained from that was a feeling of safety in that no matter what happens, I know that there are going to be people who stick by my side. And I know a lot of us can relate to letting fear dictate our lives. Whether you're straight or gay or trans, we know what it's like to let fear dictate our lives. And I don't know about you, I'm sick of it. I'm sick and tired of letting fear control my actions and my life. I don't want to be someone who is led by fear any longer. Rather, I want to seek to be a person who's led by love and compassion. So, thank y'all.
Steve, my friend, you can tell he used to do a lot of speaking, yeah? And he's also funny, I told you. It's amazing what he's saying that does weave in so much to just the core of humanity. That everyone knows what that's like to wrestle with fear. And everyone knows what that's like to be tied up in that and let that dictate their lives. And I'm grateful that he, along with so many others, are choosing to actively step out of that and into wholeness. A lot of times we're carrying around, this is an idea that I've been thinking about for a long time, that biblical narrative of old wineskins. And if you've been raised with hearing the Bible story, there's these old wineskins and new wineskins, and you start putting new wine in the old wineskin, and it eventually stretches and it breaks. And I feel like sometimes that's what we're doing with carrying around old ideas of theology, old ideas of self, our old fear, and we're hanging it in this old wineskin, expecting it to still fit in the same container, and it can't. It can't. It's time for growth. And we think letting that go is fearful, but instead there's something new, a new container waiting for you.